All right, guys. Welcome to Episode 3 of Portraits of Greatness, where we're going to talk about Emerson's lectures on representative men, and first and foremost, his first lecture, which is the uses of great men. Rashid, you wanted to include Emerson in these discussions on Carlyle. You thought it would be a great sort of melding of the two to figure out what were similar, what was different between their ideas of what great men could give the world.
Yeah, I mean, there have been more people that have talked about great men, but I think these two are sort of emblematic in how the world understands the theory itself. Like I mentioned it in the last few streams that when people talk about great men in literature courses, they usually mention Emerson and sometimes just Emerson, even without Carlyle, even though it was his whole baby to begin with. You can call it that. So I thought, especially since Emerson has a much different view of things in general, but mostly about how great men are viewed. If you read any kind of philosophy examination book on Emerson, people will always harp on the fact that his view of the great man is different than Carlyle. They will sometimes go into like sort of these summarizations. One of the most popular summarization is this, that Carlyle believes that the man should be subservient to great man, the regular man should be subservient to great man, and that subservience is how society will progress. Whereas Emerson thinks that the great men are disposable. They're basically great because individuals think them great. And if you don't think a great man is great, then that man is not great for you, at least for your own understanding of it. He has a famous quote about Homer. He says that it's not enough for Homer to have thought how to think and how to write and how to see for millions and millions of people. He also has to show me how to, he also has to impress me. He also has to show me how to see and how to understand.
Very individualistic.
Yeah, he can't. If Homer cannot do that, then all of his millions of fans or followers, they mean nothing to me. So he has a very extreme view of individualism, just like we said. But even that summarization, it's unlike the great man summarizations we think of when you look up Carlyle's theory online. That summarization is kind of correct. It's abbreviated to a point where it kind of caricatures Carlyle's thoughts, but to an extent, that is how you can separate Emerson and Carlyle. And that's why Emerson is so important to talk about, especially how we view great men in modern society. Because if you go into any kind of philosophy course and talk about how this new theory suggests that, or this theory in general suggests that you should worship great men, and that if you see a great man, you should be subservient to him, people will look at you weird. I think
they're not ready. They're not sort of prepped up to go straight into Carlyle almost. But he's a good foil for Carlyle, because as you say, although I kind of prefer reading Carlyle in some ways because it's just so enjoyable to read and there's so much energy to him. But he is probably easier to characterize, whereas Emerson, as a foil to him, certainly solidifies a great man theory as a branch of theoretical practice. So, yeah, I think, and also where they're the same, I think the most natural part of where they're the same is that idea that the great man is coming from nature. But also Emerson in his essay is much more looking at it from the view of someone who is witnessing a great man rather than from the view of the great man as living light fountain or something that Carlyle would say. So I think he starts off with, it is natural to believe in great men. So
yeah,
he also does say that the great man himself comes from nature, but I just thought it was interesting that he begun with the viewpoint of somebody watching the great man. So it's natural for someone to believe in great men, and then from there I'm going to go and flesh out this theory, which kind of it's in sync with his transcendentalist beliefs. Did you think that there's any difference in kernel there between Carlyle believing comes from nature or Emerson believing that both the belief comes from nature, the belief in the great man has to come from nature.
Yeah,
and then
there are differences, I think, definitely. The first difference is that Carlyle's whole pantheistic view sort of end in the first chapter. And you have to also mention that the way he characterizes great man coming from nature is different than how Emerson characterizes great man coming from nature. In Carlyle's view, the nature exists as this awesome power that, this awesome beauty that you can just look at endlessly for its brilliance. And within nature, the most brilliant creation is man. And you see echoes of that in Emerson as well. One of the quotes that I highlighted was, "Nature seems to exist for the excellent," he says. But if you read Emerson in detail, you will see that what he means by great man coming from nature is that basically nature, the great man springs from nature, but unlike Carlyle, where the great man springs from nature and then subjugates it and bends it to his will, Emerson seems to think that it's more alongside, he thinks that it's more gently nudging it towards a direction, and it's not even at some points contradicting nature at all. At certain points, he has this more, just like we said, pantheistic view of how great man interacts with nature. He says that great man springs from nature, but he's also a big part of nature. He's not something separate, and he definitely is not someone that, in Carlyle's view, great man comes in, and he comes in at a time where nature doesn't even expect him to come. And he comes in and bends people to his will, and if people are faithful to him, he will make great things. Whereas Emerson thinks that the very nature of how he came about, for instance, if the people didn't seem interested in him, that doesn't mean the people are doomed. It simply means that the man is not in tune with nature, for instance.
Yeah.
He would actually characterize it as such. So you can see that the Emerson's great man is not at all like this outwardly creature that can bring about amazing things. It's someone more observant of the culture and the society around him and the history that preceded it, that by studying both the contemporary culture and the culture that came before him, can lead people towards new horizons, or like new philosophies or new ways of doing things. That's Emerson's view of great men. He thinks that they come from nature and they stay in nature. They're a part of nature. They're not something that's subjugate nature. And overall, nature calls them forth. If you remember Carlyle, he says, nature doesn't call forth great men. If nature called forth great men, then there would be no disasters because nature would get the right guy and he would fix it
at the right time. Yeah. I think I latched onto that quote as well. Nature seems to exist for the excellent, and I'm because I went into this essay more expecting Emerson to be a little more buffered, a little more stabilized by his pantheistic views than what Carlyle was. Yeah. But then when I saw that quote, you kind of going, whoa, where's he going to go from here? But actually, yeah, he takes it back, because you're thinking like that's almost an extremist Darwinian position. Nature exists for the excellent, survivalist of the fittest. That's where my mind was going. But then,
and that's why Emerson has such a trouble with people taking his quotes and then using it to mean the worst things in the world.
Yeah,
I mentioned in the very first episode. Yeah.
Later, though, he has, "We must not contend against love, nor deny the substantial existence of other people." So he does. He takes it back a bit, and of course, he was very anti-slavery in the Civil War.
Yeah.
So it does chime more with his character that we saw unfolding throughout his life. That's why I was very surprised by that quote. But yes, you're right. Everything you said there is sort of correct. He gets to his like pantheistic view got to such a stage, though, then where you're like, is he going to go for the other extreme, like this almost geographical determinism, that your geography, your landscape determines everything you do as a character? which is, I think, Jared Diamond's Germs, Guns and Steel. Is that what that one's called? It's a sort of view of history, but it's known now for just being very geographical deterministic, i.e., the curvature of the bay in which your civilization emerged is going to have like this effect. It's very much everything is just this, your geography around you sculpts you, where there's nothing sort of.
You know what that reminded me of? I actually listened to this history podcast, or like an audiobook. Yeah, a history audiobook where they talked about this advanced civilization where they had indoor heating around like 300 BC or something. And he said that was possible. It was possible to have that advanced civilization where people had indoor heating. They could produce artworks that were way better than now, not now, but like way better than centuries later. And they could have this comfortable life because they lived next to a volcano. And that's also one of the reasons why they didn't survive. They could use the sort of volcanic heat and regulate it in a way to heat up their homes. And that actually allowed them to have a more comfortable existence and also pursue more comfortable lifestyle choices that would lead to an improved technology, improved arts, and so forth. So they didn't have to like work towards feeding themselves and keeping themselves warm all the time. So yeah, that reminded me of the geographic determinism. That's definitely example of geographic determinism. And even the audiobook's author had said that maybe if these people had survived, they would have plasma TVs during Caesar's time, because it was, I think, 1,000 years before Caesar. So that was an interesting thought. But Emerson, I think, would have said that, these people didn't survive because they made their homes next to a volcano.
They weren't in tune with the genuine natural elements of what a volcano is.
Yeah, like volcano only erupts like 200, 300 years. They probably didn't.
Someone who's in tune with nature would know not to set up a civilization. Yeah. Like in intrinsic, he calls it endogenous. He talks a lot about the endogenous character of man in this passage, these things which are internal and intrinsic to man, and that genius as well. The most genius amongst us are those that create almost something out of nothing to the eyes of the rest of us, because they're so in tune with nature. Whereas these people next to a volcano wouldn't have had that intrinsic endogenous feeling that Emerson gets at here, I think. But it was absent from their civilization. Yeah. Just taking it from the Emersonian point of view here, running with it a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's also the idea that, it's not something worth thinking about, that they would have gotten to such a point because they weren't going to, because they were next to a volcano.
I don't think it's a great thought experiment.
Yeah, it's a thought experiment, but it's kind of strange. Anyhow, it has a different way to interpret. That's what I'm trying to say. I should just close this book. It's going to get me really confused because I'm just looking at the pure text. And looking at the pure text of Emerson it's much harder than even like Carlyle. When Carlyle talks about something like not the living life fountain, but the deep death kingdoms. Deep death kingdoms. No. When he goes on those tangents, you can just sort of like get the gist of it and just skip that part. With Emerson, it's like he gives very interesting, very relevant images, like every single paragraph, a few times in a row. So you almost have to have this supernatural memory to memorize all of them. I must have actually read and listened to Representative Man a few times. Yet even now, when I open the first chapter, I go like, oh, he's talking about this. This is an interesting image. I don't think I've ever read that before. It's because simply just you've been to such a ride that you don't remember about 60% of what you read. And there's an interesting anecdote in his biography. Emerson was a very prolific lecture giver. We can compare him to someone like Jordan Peterson now, as someone who gets in these
Peterson of his age. Yeah.
I don't know. I find him a little creepy. But so you could think of it like that, because he was this prolific guy and he was getting huge crowds. But one of the one of these anecdotes in his biography was that he was giving these lectures that we're reading right now to common people who tilled the soil and basically weren't well read or well
To what
educated.
extent do you think that's true? That he wasn't giving these lectures to an elite audience? Or sorry, I just didn't.
Well, the Lyceum was something that was open to the public, I believe, because he was giving these in the Lyceum. And I think Mark Twain also gave a bunch of lectures in the Lyceum. And so these were open to the public. People could come in by just a fee. And it was not very high, I think, because these places had huge crowds. I think, I don't remember the exact numbers, but they're high. Like they're huge halls. And that's actually gave what Emerson, like his wealth, that he was constantly going around in these Lyceum halls and giving lectures to people. But he probably had a lot of elite audiences alongside a lot of regular audiences. People like Walt Whitman, for instance, who just wanted to like learn about literature and just were mostly self-taught, maybe. But there's this anecdote that he gave this lecture to mostly common people, and the narrator said, and everybody left with high spirits, completely oblivious to what he just said. Like not understanding a word that was said.
Some of that does come across in writing. Like that's not. I'd say it was even more hypnotic, or there was that even more. You could call it another endogenous effect. Well, that's more exogenous, right? Yeah. Emerson is putting it in on you, but yeah, that definitely comes across. And I did the stream with my friend Kev on Emerson's view on history, which takes his essay history from his first series, and just to crack open the box of what is Emerson's view on history, because I'd read it twice, differently in different times, years apart, and each time I was kind of like, by the end, you're like, but what was his actual position? So I did that whole stream just to kind of sit down and try and find out what his position was, because it is difficult sometimes to pin it down. But I think if we're looking at blocks of how do we get from great men, or where he's trying to go with his representative men theory, I think I definitely game, okay, starting from the natural roots, both the belief in great men is natural, and then the great man himself and his intrinsic genius is natural. And in fact, he says the more genius he is, like the more isolated he is from others, which is a bit odd. Because he's so unique, being able to get that straight from nature. Other people have to get it then from him in turn. So that's how he gets it.
Well, I don't think he goes into that exact way of thinking, because he does say that while great man does teach people, the people also learn to be, because we were going to go into this at the very end, but he does say that people learn to be greater men from great men. So he says that by association with the great man, you can actually gain a higher understanding that will allow you to be a greater man. Maybe. He has a very famous quote that everyone uses. He says that naive young men grow up in libraries thinking that they should read people like Milton, Goethe, or Swedenborg, not knowing that Goethe, Swedenborg, and Milton were young men in libraries when they wrote those books. So he has that idea that, you can both learn from it, and also you can use your own natural ability, or like way you observe nature to guide you towards a new understanding. So it's kind of like what Carlyle said last week, 2 weeks ago, when he said that there are different ways of being a great man. So there are ways you can learn from other people, and there are ways you can learn from nature. I think he doesn't make that much of a different sort of like a separation between the two.
So reading the representative man is an unleashing of the infinitude contained within the single individual, i.e. the reader. Like I
should actually talk about that, because self-reliance, I talked about it a few times, but self-reliance must be the most misunderstood part of Emerson's philosophy that that was ever studied, because You see it everywhere, even nowadays, that people talk about being self-reliant. And I think Emerson didn't invent the word, but he definitely, you could say, made it popular. People weren't using those two words together the same way before Emerson. But people misunderstand the self-reliance theory, just like those, millionaires or billionaires. They weren't billionaires in the 1800s, but they were millionaires. And the certain people that were abusing their workers were saying that they were self-reliant because they didn't rely on anybody else, and they didn't rely on the government. A lot of the time they did rely on the government because lobbying existed even back then. But they were self-reliant, and that's why they had a better work ethic than other people. And Emerson countered that with saying self-reliance is reliance on God. What Emerson means there is not simply that he's trying to back out, because he made this big statement that being self-reliant meant that you trust in yourself and your own ideas and be inflexible in certain ways. And he's not just trying to back away, just running away from that just because a few people used self-reliance essay to justify the bad things they did. What he actually means there is that, first of all, what is God for Emerson? What do you think?
What's his idea of God? It's certainly not a man in the sky. It's it's imbued in nature. Nature reveals his divinity.
Nature itself. Yeah. It's basically nature itself. God is nature itself. God is everything that exists within the universe. So what he means is that when you go into those very private sections of your heart, the very essence of your being, sort of, when you become a true individual, you sort of go back to your natural.
We could think of Muhammad going into the cave.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically by celebrating your own individuality, you actually become a part of the universe. It's kind of like that Buddhist idea of being in tune with nature, that he thinks that by not just taking any idea that's given to you and actually celebrating your own ideas, you don't become apart from nature, you don't become apart from society, you actually become much more integrated part of it. So it's kind of like the saying, some knowledge leads you out of nature. Gaining some knowledge in anything from math to philosophy leads you away from nature, but gaining a lot pulls you back into it, because then you know that it's all about nature and it's all about your relations to it. So that's a quote from Cezanne. It's a painter.
I know, yeah, I'm aware of Cezanne. So we get to the bit, I think, in the essay or lecture where he says, the aid we have from others is mechanical, while our own sense of discovery is natural, that men have a pictorial or representative quality and serve us in the intellect. So as you're talking there about reading about Milton or Goethe in a library, the sense of discovery we get when we reach for the book or want to even get anything out of a text itself is natural, within us, coming from nature. But then the text itself is almost like a manual or something. It's a bit more vague than a manual, but it serves as a similar sort of function. It gives us structure from which we can or exercise that sense of discovery that we have. But that's natural. And then he says representation comes in two forms of things and ideas. So what do you think about that? Do you think that's too crude a classification? I think with the ideas he's going very Platonic, right? So theory of forms, that everything is but, a lower level to the idea of the thing itself, which is its purest form.
So the quote that he talks about that is, each material thing has its celestial side, has its translation through humanity into the spiritual and necessary sphere, where it plays a part as indestructible as any other. So this is very similar to what Carlyle talked about in his first essay, when he mentioned that nature is divine and nature is worth worship. For that reason, the man is even more worth worship, because He's the best of nature. Emerson is sort of saying that nature is divine, and it's not worship, but more like it deserves reverence, and man deserves reverence. He later goes back to man, I think, right after he mentions the celestial side, to talk about the celestialness of ideas and celestialness of man and the divine. It's very hard to talk about like divinity in relations to Emerson, because he talks about it so much. Anyhow, but he does talk about the divineness of man. But before he talks about that, he talks about the divineness of nature and divineness of things in general. He talks about celestial essence and so forth. So that's how I took it. He doesn't say a man is the greatest part of nature, although he does have quotes that can be interpreted as such.
Yes, he has bits where he certainly seems to think it's on a pedestal above, any other animal or something.
Man is the center for nature.
It's not entirely clear why. Is it because he believes man can conceive of nature better than any other animal? But I'm not sure that entirely squares with this thought. I don't know. I think I did have a bit here which kind of fleshes that out a little bit. Man converts raw materials of nature to his use. I don't know if he found respect in that. But he says, similarly, so do we with the representative man, who is of nature. So the representative man is like so much imbued within nature that he is basically like a raw material of nature, but take that in the form of ideas. So
we should probably talk about the representative aspect of representative man.
He is the raw material, and then we can use him the same way we will use other pieces of raw material throughout nature. Would you agree with that interpretation of Emerson?
I definitely do think that's what he means. It's sort of this reverence towards raw work with your hands that
you tie it back to Carlyle's labor.
The very first essay. A lot of it ties back to Carlyle, just a little more progressiveness sprinkled in.
Progressiveness, but also a little more. It's more composed or something. It's
much more. It's not just talking about pantheism in a sort of. It's not just paying homage to pantheism. It's actually a pantheist text, like every single Emerson's text. It's in that sense, it echoes Carlyle in many aspects, as Carlyle himself goes into pantheism quite a bit in the very first chapter. I don't think it echoes the second chapter as much.
Not so much.
Although he does mention
elements, like when we talked about Muhammad going to the cave, or him being like solemn beneath the stars. It's very subtle, but it's there throughout all his work, and it's kind of like you can never know when he's going to throw it in, because you never quite know.
We should explain that Prophet Muhammad going into the cave is when Muhammad is given his very first messages from God. So the Prophet Muhammad would go to this cave every few months or so, I believe, to just listen to his own thoughts and just make sense of things, so to say. And while he was doing that, and he was 40, in his 40s, he was visited by an angel, and that's how Islam began, and that's how his prophethood began. So in that sense, it is exactly as we said, this going back towards yourself and going back towards what makes you. And in this isolation, you find that you're much more in tune with nature than you thought. When you were just being influenced by all these outer forces, basically.
Yeah, the exogenous versus endogenous experience of life that Emerson seems to want to be
there's
getting.
A lot more of that on self-reliance. I would even say that self-reliance essay itself is a greater precursor to the representative man theory than the uses of great men, the essay that is the very first essay of the representative man book. So, in that sense, we might talk about self-reliance after we're we've gone through all these essays as it
Sure.
relates to the great man theory. But yeah, Emerson is very consistent with his philosophy, at least. Like,
Well,
unlike
one part
Carlyle,
I want
kind of.
one part I want to flesh out though is we
Yeah.
talked about. So we take the representative man. He comes from natural. He comes closer to nature almost than us, or it's going through him. Let's just say we're not great men of pure natural Emerson.
Emerson would say, "Didn't you know that great men in themselves were people live streaming about they're not being great men?"
He has a quote saying each plant has its parasite, which I found strange. Because are we not meant to be inspired by these great men, take their raw materials, use them? Surely that's not a parasitical relationship. And there's later he talks about the taunt of Boswellism, almost like he thought of Boswell following Johnson as, I don't know, if he thought it was too parasitical a relationship. So where's the line for Emerson there? I think that was quite vague. That was something I didn't, but it might get fleshed out in some of the later lectures. But are we taking the raw materials of these men and then imbuing ourselves with the greatness, using them as a mechanical platform for our own natural sense of exploration and discovery? Well, when do we just become parasites then doing that? You know? I suppose there were parasites of reading in the library. Is that?
Well, in this book, first we read, then we write. Emerson makes a lot of distinctions because this book is about Emerson's ideas on how writing should be done and how you should read in order to write yourself. Because he says, as the book title says, first we read, then we write. I'm making a
and
lot
that's
of
why.
for this
Just
book.
give us the author name. There.
That's by Robert D. Richardson. We might put a link underneath. We
Yeah.
probably will. We done that the last episode. So in this book, which compiles Emerson's writings on writing, basically, Emerson makes a lot of distinctions between what is yours and what is someone else's. He says that if you're going to read someone else in order to get inspired to make works of your own, first of all, you should not, if you get inspired while reading, you should just put it down and get to work. You should not be reading while being inspired. And he even makes some very strange recommendations. For instance, he says that if you get absorbed in your text, you should put it down. You should not read anymore, because if you get too absorbed in it, it will destroy your own thought. And he has this very solid notion of knowing what is yours and knowing what is someone else's. If you take someone else's idea, that you won't be able to materialize this because it's not yours. Emerson makes that distinction very clear. You should be aware of what is yours. You should be aware of what you own. But because if you don't, you won't be able to use it to its fullest potential. You'll just be trying to be someone else. So he makes that distinction clear, and he makes the distinction clear in this very essay itself. He says that, great men come, and when they're gone, you're not going to have a great man like that anymore. You're not going to have another great man. Yeah, they're not going to have another man like him, he says. And, he says that I think in the same paragraph, he mentions the parasitic nature. Might not be the same chapter, but he does talk about how trying to be a great man, the exact great man that you want to be, is just a fool's errand. You will never be able to do it. But you can gain from association, he says. And he quotes Napoleon.
Yes,
at some point he says that. I believe.
I actually don't think I wrote it down as a quote, but it was good.
I wrote it down. That's fine. He says activity is contagious. Napoleon had said to one of his generals that you must not fight too often with one enemy. You must not fight often with one enemy, or you will teach him all your art of war. So if you just keep fighting this one guy, I believe there's a historical example of a general that was basically just failing all through his first campaigns against this kingdom. But then after he failed so many times, he came back and just started winning like crazy against the people that have foiled him.
That's why I think as well, if you're let's say you're going up against a computer in some sort of game, or there's some setting where you're up against a computer, it's not a person. You will eventually game that, as in you will conquer that, because it's only an algorithm. They're repeating the same things. Whereas you as an individual can sprinkle that new, you could call it the sense of discovery that Emerson wants.
Yeah, I think it was in an extra credits episode that I saw that in the episode itself. I don't remember the exact extra credits. Videos are so easy to go through, but you don't remember much about what they were talking about later. But I remember that the general kept on, like, they were quite snarky about it. The general thought the best choice of options were to lose, and the general thought, maybe I should do that failing thing more. A few more times, and he had the brilliant idea: fail. So he has that, and then at the end of towards the end of the series, they say, and then he had a bright idea: what if I succeeded? So is that notion of if you fight against an enemy so many times that they might actually get wise to your peculiar tricks and strategies. So in that sense, he gives that example as a means that you can how you can learn from great men, is that you can associate with them. It's not so much as trying to be them or trying to or suck up to them, but it's more like associate with them so you can learn a great deal more than you have now. It's kind of similar to interacting with nature.
Another aspect I think he said, which was like, I may have gained this indirectly, right? I'm not saying this was his intention, but that when you worship a great man or you're involved in that practice, yes, it gives exactly what you say, a framework, or it's the mechanical device through which you're not being them, you're not being the parasitical person, but you are being inspired by them. And then there's a subtlety to that, which kind of sometimes you just have to know in life. But there's another thing that is good about being in part of that great man worship, is that it destroys a hubris within yourself, because once you're looking at these other people who achieved greatness, it kind of puts you in perspective next to them. So it destroys hubris, but also it kind of destroys a nemesis as well, because when you're engaged in the worship of great men, you're never envious of them. It's kind of only a connotation of influence and inspiration, but really, you never feel envious. You can feel envious sometimes of contemporaries, but you never have that envy in this sort of when you're viewing a representative man. So I thought that was another sort of good beneficiary. It kind of came to me indirectly as I was reading it, but
I think it's part of the notion that Emerson points out here, that great men don't work for themselves. They work for society and nature at large. They work for the benefit of them. They don't work for themselves. And I believe at the very last essay, he talks about how Napoleon had failed in a sort of sense to be a great man, because he actually brought a lot of more death and destruction than it would have existed without him. So he thinks that definitely great men, because we're more willing to learn from great men without being envious, it's probably because he thinks that they signify being unselfish and working towards the benefit of society. What do you think about that interpretation?
Yeah, a lot of that, some of that is a bit too kind of soft for me. Like that Napoleon is great because you have to rustle a few feathers to be great, I think. So if you're not great because you disturbed a peace, I'm not sure that adds up at all. Because
you'll have a lot to talk about in the very last essay then. Well, I think we have Napoleon as intercrossing between hero.
Yeah, we've got a few intercrossers. I think Goethe he's kind of mentioned by Carlyle, but he's more mentioned by Emerson. Shakespeare, of course, is another one that they both took an interest in. But yeah, I don't agree with that ultimately, that like if you break a piece, you're not in the pantheon. That doesn't fly for me. I think you have to rustle a few feathers and you have to be bold. Being bold and being brave is a massive part of it. Not being soft, passive. It's about being active. So I don't think that adds up. Sorry, Emerson. I did, or am I misinterpreting?
We will have opportunity to talk about that in length at that episode. because I read that like a few years ago. I haven't read
But,
up to that point yet, but I do know that he reaches that conclusion with Napoleon.
one thing he doesn't mention, now this could come up later, that I think is really big in Carlyle, is Carlyle's idea of getting order from chaos, right? To think about, he gave us imagery of like the creation of the planets from the vacuum of space, the potter's wheel. And then what made me think of this was Emerson goes through an image of Columbus, that the great man can be road makers. So Columbus makes the charts that everyone uses now to get to America, in a sort of more spiritual, of course. They're not the exact same
Oh yeah,
lines,
he says that
but without
every
Columbus, there's no
novelist
chart.
is
Yeah,
a debtor to Homer too.
exactly. But that's for me. So he took the figure of Columbus, but for me, it was very different how Carlyle portrayed Columbus, because for Carlyle, the sea was like this chaos, and Columbus tamed it. You know, it was the vast unconquerable. Whereas here, he's looking at it from a later generation. The people using the shipping lines are using that used by Columbus, whereas Carlyle's looking at it from Columbus's view. He stared at the sea, and it was this vast unconquerable thing, and he said, "I'm going to conquer it," sort of thing. So there's a lot less talk of chaos in Emerson's. Maybe that's because he believes nature has this, we're always in nature. Nature is the universe. Whereas Carlyle believes a little bit more in that the vacuum of space is a chaos. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
So my thoughts on that is that this whole subjugation idea, we already talked about that, but Emerson does not believe that the hero comes in and subjugates things to his will. He thinks that he rides along with nature. So in that sense, Emerson does not think of nature as this chaos that needs to be mended in a way that, you have to impose your will exactly upon it. It's because that's sort of the idea that has very much roots in Western culture, in certain Western cultures, and in certain Eastern ones as well. Confucius philosophers were also interested in mending natural impulses and making these rituals towards the right conduct, so you could mend the chaos that is a person's natural impulses and certain thing, their method of running a society. Well, Emerson doesn't go for that as much as the Confucius or the more Western philosophers. Emerson, and I think he mentions Mencius. He's another Chinese philosopher. Mencius is kind of between the more left-leaning Taoists and the more way right, conservative-leaning Confucius. Mencius is somewhere in the moderate, liberal kind of space, where he believes that you need to actually direct people in a natural manner and not just impose your will on them, but you need to make the effort to do so. He doesn't think that you need to have extremely strict customs and so forth, where, in Confucius's time, they would go into a carriage and you couldn't look anywhere like here or there. You just need to look straight up, and just that this was the correct way. If you looked at this direction, you were being extremely disrespectful. So Mencius believed that you should make an effort towards a natural way of handling things, but you shouldn't just say that nature is itself, and you should just live in nature and just go take your toilet in the river or something.
Take that, then. No, that's an interesting way to broaden Eastern philosophy.
He mentions Mencius in a way that he reads. Obviously, Emerson reads quite a bit of Eastern texts as well. Mostly Eastern texts that have Western translators, therefore probably are very
it's gone through a sort of filter
with Western
already.
ideas. Yeah, it's pretty apocryphal for the most part, but he does get the idea, and he has it inside of him, that in order to live in peace with nature, you have to actually try to lead people and yourself in a natural manner. You shouldn't just try to impose everything on the world. He's not a Taoist, in a sense that he thinks that everything natural is good, and that you should not care so much for, you should not be a hippie, basically. You shouldn't just condemn capitalism and condemn all these condemn technology, all these things that have brought us so much wealth, and just say, "Oh, I'm in tune with nature." But he does believe that you need to go towards a natural direction and just subjugating everything to your will and saying that, "Well, I'm a great man, so you guys gotta worship me so I can do great things." Which is kind of what Carlyle goes with.
Yeah,
So
Carlyle's a lot more like Confucius there.
Yeah, a lot more like Confucius.
Because even when he's talking about French Revolution, and he talks about the reasons why Louis says, the king during the revolution is not a great man, is a weak leader, because he's got in the time of chaos, he's got somebody on his left shoulder, somebody on his right. They're telling him this, they're telling him that, and he even uses the metaphor of the king just constantly turning his head like this instead of just gazing straight ahead, which is funny because it's exactly what you said Confucius had there. Whereas Emerson, he talks more about an audacious mental habit, and we said he likes the theory of ideas comes from his theory of forms from Plato, but I think later he brings in Aristotle. Once the great man has got, the representative man from Emerson's point of view, has gotten his thing from nature, that it seems that at that point it's much more where Emerson is concerned about, and it's at that point where this idea of needing to stay rigid and look like that, it's far less important. So, I read Aristotle in bits here, like, our thoughts and manners become great by being exposed to the representative men. That, talking about manners, talking about habits, I think it was really interesting. Carlyle wouldn't really talk about the habit of somebody becoming great from looking at the other. It's exactly like, you don't listen to the left and right shoulder, you just go forward. But Emerson is much more concerned with those habits. So I thought that was interesting, that Carlyle is Confucius, but to do an analogy there.
Yeah,
is there any other bit you want to bring up around this? Because I have some other bits before we get to his.
While we're on the subject of this notion of how you view great men and how you view nature as relating to it. Last week we had an argument about what I thought was hero worship examples in the left. And to an extent, I do think that left has certain way of, we shouldn't just say the left, but more like these sort of extreme left views that you see in college campuses and so forth. And I saw when I was in college, and
the extreme left, which just happens to be in every ascendant institution.
Yeah, basically, it's even here. But yeah, basically, we talked about how I thought that especially considering Carlyle's quote that great man was an ever-changing thing, an ever-changing concept, and the way you worship great men is an ever-changing concept in itself. And I said that maybe these left-leaning scholars, students, and so forth, and teachers, maybe they have this view of boundless admiration towards someone as it relates to more left-leaning writers of present and certain people of the past. Because I mentioned that they read this poetry book that I thought was complete garbage, it was complete garbage. We read some good ones, but the one that was the most recent was absolute trash. And they were reading it like it was very, very important text. And I thought, they're basically basing their views on this based on the fact that this is a famous, not really that famous, but a famous trans writer of color. So I thought that they were trying to, just ticking all the boxes. So they have boundless admiration towards him. What I didn't understand was, what I did not really think of at the time was that when Carlyle and even Emerson talks about great men, they usually talk about great men as relating to a topic or an interest or something they represent. As as in Emerson's case, he talks about men being representative of things. So in that sense, the certain admiration towards people the left has doesn't make a lot of sense. I will give you that as it relates to the great man theory, because, for instance, Noam Chomsky, he's a guy whose basically on every liberal-leaning podcast he's talked about. He's not on every one, but like he's talked about all the time, and he's brought on to talk about economics. He's brought on to talk about gender equality. He's brought on to talk about race issues. This guy's a linguist. He was a linguist scholar for most of his life. Why is he being touted as an expert in race issues, an expert in economics? You know, so he can come and like talk about who should be president, who should be ruling, who should you listen to, and so you know, and going forward.
He is their sage. He's almost like of their.
Yeah. So in that sense, it is not exactly hero worship, because Carlyle, I don't think would have agreed, and I want to get your opinion on this. Carlyle, I don't think would have agreed someone's influence being broaden over this much, especially in the intellectual fields. I think he would have felt that he was just trying to basically be the new, because both Emerson and Carlyle talk about more popular writers and more popular lecturers who are just blowing gas. I know Emerson talks about them quite a bit. He says that in every age, there's this one guy that everyone listens to, everyone writes about, and everyone reads. And then literally as the age ends, no one ever remembers him, because his ideas were meant to be just enjoyed in the present. Like not enjoyed as it is relevant to now, as opposed to as it is going to be relevant in the future. We still read Emerson, but some of the books that sold better than Emerson at this time, we don't read quite a bit of them. So in that sense, there are people that are just trying to draw in crowds, and I think they would thought of someone like Noam Chomsky as that type of an example of a person. I heard. Are you familiar with Thomas Sowell?
Yep.
Yeah, so he was talking about the intellectuals and society in one of his books, and he says, why are people like Noam Chomsky trying to go out of their fields in this drastic manner, talk about all these other things and become a rock star in like these intellectual circles? It's because, if you're a linguist, you're only famous around linguists. If you're a if you're a chess master, then you're famous around the world. Everyone knows you for being a chess master, so you don't need to go into politics in order to like prove how smart you are. People already know, like Magnus Carlsen, for instance. Like Magnus Carlsen doesn't need to talk about a different political philosophy that he's gotten into in order to like become an intellectual in that field. He's already very ingrained in it. And I think what Thomas Sowell gives as an example is Bob Fischer or someone else, Bob Fischer or David
Bobby
Fischer.
Fischer, isn't he a chess player?
Bobby Fischer. He talks about Bobby Fischer. He doesn't need to like go and become an intellectual. He can just stay safe in his own spot as a legendary chess master. So I was listening to that, and I thought, so in that sense, the intellectuals that are being touted as heroes, in that sense, what you said last week was true, that they were having more of a religious interest in that person rather than someone that they could learn even through subjugation, like Carlyle would have thought about.
I think there's a lot there to unpack. Last week you talked about that worship, and I said no, it was more like sainthood worship, which is the same point Tom Holland makes. In his, I think he made it in his own podcast. I'm not sure if he makes it in Dominion, his book on the continuing influence of Christianity and throughout Western life. But so that was like, now we have two types. So we're talking about worships in people or worships involving people, and does that mean they're immediately in the great man pantheon? And I would say no. So there was two types. There's the great man Carlylean, Emersonian. I would still put Emerson in the same pantheon as Carlyle, the theory-wise, just with different branches of the same tree, you could say. Whereas the sort of worship they were engaged in the universities was a sainthood worship, more akin to how people would have, shrines to saints who gave up stuff or who suffered a lot throughout their life. And then it was in the suffering that they had this self-contained virtue, rather than being in this awe-inspiring greatness that Carlyle, or, this greatness that can inspire. Emerson uses words like inspiration as well. So for me, that's two different theories there. And then a third is what you just talked about there, which is the kind of momentary popularity or celebrity status, which I think is different again from the other two. So I think that's a third one. Someone who's really famous. I would put Chomsky more in two. He's not worshipped as a saint. I'd say he's worshipped. He's brought down on high for his sort of moral insights.
Yeah.
It's similar to like a religious mold, whereas the third one you're talking about there is like that momentary popularity. People would come in and very popular for one generation, and then sort of disappear again. There's parts of that, like I know in Carlyle's own time, Walter Scott was enormous. You can still get Walter Scott novels, and they're decently read. He hasn't vanished entirely. There's probably better examples, but I think he was just extremely popular in Carlyle's time. But I still want to read some of his. So he has had a bit of a lasting legacy, but I think it's definitely not as durable as other writers. Dickens comes to mind as much more defining an age. But yeah, so I think now you could say last week we just we're fleshing out the idea that there's two types right, to this worship, but now maybe there's three types we can say. I don't know if you want we can sculpt our own framework here. Yeah. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because I had bits of Christian thought on Emerson's essay, The Uses of Great Men, because we talked last week or 2 weeks ago how Carlyle, did he bring in Muhammad because he was scared to open the box named Christianity, whereas Emerson seems a little less scared to mention it, maybe because he's being a little less bold in what he's about to say. But he mentions the Bible cannot be closed, and at that point he kind of really starts to compare this representative man to Christian absolution. Like, if you're reading about these representative men, how is that different to you being inspired by God, right? Or by reading about them, you're sort of, it's weird. The language he started to use here is very religious. I am healed of my hurts. I am made immortal by apprehending my possession of incorruptible goods. So the incorruptible good is the representative man at this point. And you're like, you've gained absolution almost. It was just, I found it strange that he was going there, whereas Carlyle kind of stepped back. He talked about paganism. He talked about Islam. He was not going to go into Christ. But then later, Emerson says, is the great man a scourge of God then? Because can you misapply the worship that you should have for God, which, as we said in Emerson, is nature? Can you put that into the great man rather than in nature itself, which is what you should be doing in Emerson's eyes? So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I thought it was very interesting that he went there. He didn't fully go there, but he went there more than what Carlyle went there.
Well, when talking about what Emerson thought of as opposed to like talking about religion and Christianity and so forth, remember, this is the guy who wrote in Self-Reliance, if my impulses are from the devil, then I am therefore the devil's child. Or like, I think he says, I am therefore from the devil, he says. And it's also very important to know that Emerson was kind of, I'm going to give the comparison of friggin' Jordan Peterson again, but he's kind of a controversial figure like Jordan Peterson of his time. People don't usually know this as much, but Emerson was heckled constantly and was actually very experienced in handling hecklers in his audience. And people would turn the road when they came upon Emerson, like in the streets. Some people would just turn away and just walk in the other direction. Some people would just spit in his direction. He was not someone that was basically
universally loved.
He was not like a moderate guy who was just not political at all. He was not Matthew McConaughey, just going, I'm a moderate. I'm fine with everyone. He was a guy that was hated by certain people and certain groups of people that just thought of him as an atheist. They thought of him as someone who doesn't believe in God, and someone's who's trying to lead other people astray from God. It's kind of like how they
False
viewed
prophet.
Spinoza. Yeah, Spinoza in his lifetime, they were like, he's an atheist. He wants all of us to not believe in God. Whereas Emerson was probably more interested in people not thinking of God as their imaginary friend. Kind of like he's in nature, so you don't need to like basically treat him like another guy, for instance, that you talk to in your head. That's kind of what Spinoza was probably going for too. So in that sense, Emerson was not afraid, I believe, in certain aspects, because he also had a very strong support network, I think. He was friends with some of the most
managed to get his face on the side of the Library of Congress, right? So he must have been pretty well connected.
Yeah, he was very well connected and very wealthy in his time. So in that sense, Emerson probably had a better support network than Carlyle in certain aspects, because Carlyle, I think, never got very rich, as far as I can learn from his biography.
No, I haven't visited his house in Chelsea, but I've walked past it. I would say it was decent for its time. But yeah, he was a little bit outcast from the other literary circles in England because he absorbed so much of German thought and German mysticism that they didn't like that.
Yeah, but in that sense, Emerson probably felt more comfortable saying these things about God and so forth. I told you before we started this podcast, I didn't have much to say on this topic of religion as opposed to, as viewed by Emerson, other than that, he viewed the idea of subscribing to Catholicism or Protestantism as foolish, and he told people that, he told people he thought it was foolish to just pick one denomination and just go with it and leave all the others behind. So in that sense, I think that's what Emerson believes as opposed to nature, but religion. But I don't quite get what that quote itself is trying to tell us exactly how God is viewed. It's probably one of those quotes that I didn't understand when I first read it, and I still don't understand now. I'll probably have to research it a lot more. I seem to know a lot more.
It could be that he didn't fully get to grips with it in his own time, though, as well. That's why he says the Bible cannot be closed. But also, you can't close the book on sort of it's Pandora's box, right? It's like you're not going to be able to solve it, but it's also something that cannot be closed. So it's possible that he realized he couldn't come up with an exact resolution between the worship of the great man and God. Yeah,
it's kind of like that idea of if something survived for 2,500 years or 3,000 years, it will probably survive another 3,000 years. Whereupon something that only survived for 50 years will probably not see 300. I think Nassim Nicholas Taleb makes that argument in Anti-Fragile. That you can
that's
be sure
part of the awe you
we
see
will
though when
still
you see
use
the
forks in 100 years. We will still be using forks and spoons, he says, in relation to that. So, yeah, I would like to see it as that. What he says about Bible. So we got through his ideas on religion, and I would like to actually mention something.
Go for it.
Okay. Serving others is serving us. He mentions that it's a direct quote, but he's going into more detail when he talks about it. But it's kind of this part of the great man's unselfishness that he views serving others as, he says that if you're going to follow a great man and you try to be a great man yourself, you need to put others before you as a way to help yourself, in a sense. So what do you think of that idea he brings up? I think he brings it up very in a short paragraph. If you were in a short paragraph, but it's got a lot in it, so you have to
So the great man helps himself by helping others. Is that what you think he's getting at?
I think is what he's getting at that.
He's almost heading there into the other tree, the sainthood tree that we talked about, where it's about giving, away, or else being in a position like it's very Christian charity for me. That I'm not sure. Carlyle certainly wouldn't talk about that. I think you don't. If anybody else, they get stuff from you, but you're not giving it to them, right? You're living your life as the light fountain, and then anyone else, you're shining a light so they can even see anything.
Rather than thinking of that light fountain quote as from Emerson. They're so alike. There's such a thing that Emerson would say that I keep thinking, didn't Emerson say something like that in Representative Man? That I keep thinking, no, I think that was probably Carlyle.
There is a lot of crossover, right, as well. Yeah. And I think one of them was, he is a monarch who gives a constitution to his people, was a quote where I was like, yeah, that's a real crossover with Carlyle. Because think French Revolution, where even though Louis XVI is still the king, Carlyle keeps talking about King Mirabeau or King Danton in the National Assembly because they're already the real king, because they're the ones who are actually giving a constitution, or you can think about it as a covenant rather than a constitution, and then you can get into the religious aspect as well of great men. But like, you have to have the constitution. You have to be the person who can make it march. That agrees with Carlyle. This part of, I don't know, maybe it's just the language. Again, you mentioned Chomsky was a linguist. There's a lot of, like, you can have very similar ideas, but if you just put it in the wrong sort of language, immediately it just jars with me because it becomes too much about charity, which is fine in and of itself. But I just don't think it belongs to that tree of greatness.
You're basically using morality as a weapon to spread your ideas. Because, yes. I've also been reading a lot of Chinese philosophy lately, so I've been reading a lot about how morality is a tool and not exactly something good in of itself.
If it makes your constitution march, then you can square that with the idea that Carlyle's getting about. You have to make a constitution, not just in theory, but in practice. So if you're using that morality as a weapon, then maybe it is making the constitution march in that sense. But there's a lot of holes you could poke in that argument, I think.
Yeah, Emerson also mentions that the dream of great man is a dream of youth. He mentions that people that are somewhat young are the most interested in great men. Would it be appropriate to ask how old you are? I don't think I've ever learned it.
Just turned 28 quite recently.
28.
Yeah.
My goodness. Okay, I definitely thought you were around 23. It's a very youthful pace. Yeah. You're 4 years older than me, actually.
No, wow.
That's very interesting. But what do you think?
I think he's talking there.
Are we interested in great men because we're very young people?
The ambition of the youth. There's an ambition to youth. They want to excel in life. I mean, that's just a natural thing. I'm not sure that links with the dream of the great man. I think that's more broadly just the stage you are at in life. Like anyone can tell you that. I think that's just a normal take. It's a well-observed fact that young people want to. But I think you can lend it to when you're really ambitious, when you're young, will you end up being envious of your contemporaries rather than going into the Emersonian or Carlylean great man worship that perhaps you should be going into? So that's an interesting aspect or avenue to take on that.
Yeah, I think it also relates to how Emerson views life and its stages in general. In Love, he talks about how at the beginning of love, when you're young, you have these sort of viewpoints as opposed to how things are supposed to go. And then as you mature, those viewpoints shift into much more somber ones. And then you go through another phase of life. So he does view life in sort of phases. I think it's sort of, it deals with the fact that at his time and with himself in general, he crystallized his own thoughts of the world around the ages of 30 and so forth. So he didn't have like
I think that's quite true though, isn't it? You by the time you're 30, I think it's well known people don't usually change their political positions or there's a couple of core fundamental beliefs people obtain about life. And when they reach 30, it's locked in. I mean, it can change, but it's a very rare occurrence for it to change. I think it's that lens where we're at though now, a lens to the closing, heading towards the closing part of his bit where he talks about there is, however, a speedy limit to this. I mean, you can talk about there, you believe in stages of life. That could be, it's at your own limit to a certain extent. But other ones, he talks about the qualities of availableness. So he talks about great men can be inhibited by their landscape far more than I think what Carlyle talks about. He says that it's almost like it's the great unmentionable of Carlyle. I think we came up in one of our previous ones where we're like,
I think the great unmentionable of Carlyle is great men's faults.
faults. Like, and that he brushes off in 1 second.
Yeah, like he first says, like, faults make a person. We should actually listen to the faults. Let's just move away from them for now, though.
But the question then, I think, remains, if the great man is inhibited as well by his landscape or by what's available in his own time, to what extent then are we inhibited, and to what extent can his constraints stop the transfer of, the great his great ideas, his representative ideas coming to us, because his representative ideas are stuck in their time. You can link this back to the people who get very popular, but then never sort of keep that popularity through multiple generations, right? Is it because their greatness, their constraints of their greatness and the constraints of our own landscape makes that transfer impossible?
I think
he opens up
views,
the idea of restraints.
I think he views the idea of being in tune with nature as not only being in tune with the nature of the present, but nature in general, within time and space. I think for that reason, he makes a distinction of authors that are famous for a few decades as opposed to authors that have been famous for centuries. I think he views being in tune with nature as something timeless, in a sense, because he says that Bible cannot be stopped, closed, because it's something that's timeless. It will still be read in a few thousand years because it has ingrained itself so well within nature. You could say that about a lot of texts from like the old Chinese texts from like before century, like Confucius we just talked about, or less Confucius texts and so forth. But texts that are ingrained in nature itself do survive the times, sort of like times ravages, better than texts that have that just made sure to like fit into what people wanted rather than what was right for nature. You can also say that about certain texts that didn't become famous until their author's death, in a sense that the author cared about how it would fit into nature in general rather than the people of the time, and didn't try to pander to them. I think that I kind of see that as an adequate explanation for myself, but we can go into
definitely
when you read about later.
When you read about those constraints, it definitely, that we talked about how right at the start how Emerson is a bit more of an easier gateway into this than Carlyle, and I think by him recognizing these sort of constraints, it definitely familiarizes ourselves with it a bit more, because we're reading people and getting these restraints. But that kind of leads, you talked there about time's ravages, and I think that leads to the last bit I wanted to get from this, or mention, was Emerson's, you said he sprinkles progressiveness throughout his text more than Carlyle. He doesn't really talk about time ravages. For him, nature grows, and what's the word he becomes? Nature is an amelioration rather than something that is decaying. And then this lends to his idea that we learn from great men so we can become greater men, which is very sort of progressive. Yeah,
he doesn't view it as a boom and bust cycle as Thomas Carlyle thinks.
There's no cyclical theory.
There's a great man, and then it busts when the great man is not there, when disaster strikes, and then it just sort of like goes on. Emerson is much more on the side of God, I can't remember his name. An economist that was libertarian. Hayek, I think. I was almost going to say Selma Hayek, for God's sake. But no, Hayek. is a very well-known economist who agreed that boom and bust cycle was bad, and that we should actually try to free the markets as well as possible so they can take their natural course. In that sense, Emerson is sort of championing that instead of just championing the idea that we need people to drive the markets toward a certain way. So,
but I found that very strange, because he's a naturalist, right? And there are bits of Goethe in there. Goethe wrote his treatise on morphology. I think he talks about man as can be a leaf, or the idea of that he's lending himself to that sort of imagery. But the leaf is obsessed. People who are sometimes obsessed with nature put in cyclical developments in there, because a plant will have its periods of growth, and then its periods of decay. Whereas he doesn't seem to think that he doesn't talk about decay much at all. That we will learn from these great men, so we become greater men. Full stop. No decay. Which I find strange.
Well, it's kind of like the idea that if you view decay as something bad, then sure, decay is bad. But if you view decay as an essential change within within the nature of man and the nature of the world, then it's not something bad at all. So in that sense, Emerson,
he thinks of it like a metamorphosis.
Yeah, it's kind of like that Taoist idea of, just be, if you're gonna, don't put life on a bigger pedestal than death. And when you're living, just live as well as you can. When you're dead, die as well as you can. Be dead as well as you can. And that's the best way to live life, they think. Yeah, because, in the end, it is an essential step, and it is an essential change. Worrying about it doesn't matter. So in that sense,
so does his progressivism then jar with other? Does his progressivism jar with others then? Like our current progressivism is going against nature, right? You could see.
Well, current progressivism has gotten some pointers from much more conservative ideas of the past, such as that this infallible nature of people, and that you're perfect. If you're less than perfect, then you're not worth staying within our circles. A lot of canceling of people.
Oh yes,
and
the purity spiral.
A lot of. Yeah, I love that. I saw a video of a guy saying cancel culture wasn't real, and then a month later, one of his best friends was canceled.
Yeah,
so. And one of his other best friends made a video about why cancel culture was real and that it was bad. So it's definitely this notion of this progressivism would definitely divert from Emerson in the way they started handling ideas that are opposed to them. They're no longer like championing free speech in that sense. They are very much on the side of policing free speech, and that is not at all a progressive idea. That's as conservative of an idea you can get, like old school conservative, 1800s.
This is the idea we reached our perfection.
Well, like 1500s, yeah, ban books, church ban books.
Have you ever read Henry Adams? His Education of Henry Adams. It's because I found it interesting. I was thinking that there is this progressive bent to Emerson that's not in Carlyle. I'm not sure Carlyle's essay series aren't strictly degenerative, but he does start as hero of God, and then the forms are slowly going down. Whereas Emerson is talking about great men beget greater men. I was thinking, was that an Americana mindset of the 19th century, the great exploration, the manifest destiny feeling that was within a lot of Americans at the time, whereas Carlyle was already viewing these troubled churns of Chartism, question of England, the condition of England question rather. But then I thought about Henry Adams, because Henry Adams is an American. It was a bit later, and his Education of Henry Adams is published in 1918, just the end of the Great War. But it's like talks about his life from the 1860s onwards. But he becomes very upset when he reads the second law of thermodynamics, which is everything has this entropic nature. And entropy will fuse out. Anything that's solid will become unsolid over time. And he sort of believes that this is happening to everything cultural around him. So I thought at first, was it Emerson and Americana? But then I thought of Henry Adams and was like, I don't think that's strictly the case, because Adams comes up with a much more pessimistic view of nature, having read about thermodynamics. Whereas, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. That is there something about the Americana nature to Emerson that makes him more optimistic than Carlyle? Or is that just...
I think definitely when it comes to American writers of the time, they were definitely very proud of the fact that they were diverging in certain aspects from European culture. The whole of Emerson's existence, you could say, is that he talks about how America needs to gain its own identity. So whenever they read this piece of work that wasn't related to how Europe thought, or how they themselves thought in many respects, because they were mostly Puritan conservatives. So in that sense, they were actually proud of the fact that they were reading all these other works and all these other ideas, and they were exploring them in detail, because they thought that was the way we're going to build our own identity. That's how we're going to get out of the shadow of Europe. And in a way, they succeeded in writing, at least. And some decades, they also succeeded in the arts, such as when they championed Impressionism, where people in France would ridicule them. And when they championed other art, the arts that came after Impressionism, that also became very influential, such as Cubism and so forth. So in a sense, Americans had built this identity that they needed to divert from European ideas as much as possible and gain their own identity that was built on these classical liberal kind of framework, but could also very much divert from it. So that's what I think on the topic. I think that he was very proud that he was had a more progressive views on certain things. He was very proud of the fact that he could say, "I am from the devil," and he wouldn't be executed for it. And he had a support framework, just like I said. He wasn't just going around saying, "I'm from the devil" to everyone. And just he was a college dropout.
Yes.
Trying to delivering boxes. No, he had quite a lot of money. He had quite a lot of power. He knew Abraham Lincoln. He met Abraham Lincoln quite a few times. Lincoln was a fan of his writing. He was not the type of guy that would be thrown in jail for saying these things. Although his buddy Henry David Thoreau didn't have that much of a... Henry David Thoreau probably had the biggest balls of all of them, because he actually didn't get thrown in jail. But he actually did commit crimes. He didn't just write about stuff. So the crime of not paying taxes, obviously, but it's the crime nonetheless. Emerson wasn't going around dodging taxes. So that's what I can say on the topic.
America was founded on dodging taxes.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. And I think we talked about great men existing for other great, so there can be more great men. Indeed.
So I suppose as a closing remark, where's your compass on that? Is it more
where is my compass on great men exist, so there may be greater men? I don't think there should be any other reason for great men to exist to begin with, and if we try to subjugate personal liberty and individual liberties in order to appease this man we think is great because he's doing these things and we think he can be a savior, I think that's also like going easy on the man himself. Emerson would have said he needed to actually prove to people that he was worth following, rather than we just sort of assume he's great because he did a few things that were great and that we should help him. So in that sense, Emerson is more down to earth with that statement. You should only follow people as to what you think they can give you, rather than some sort of this religious respect towards them that will transcend time and space, and that's the correct way of handling. So I'm on that spectrum of great men are, we shouldn't just dismiss them without engaging them first. But if you engage them and we don't get anything out of it, then there's no point in there's no point in handling with something you're not meant to handle. And even if you like only stick to the classics, there's no way you can read every single classic, every single influential text, and so forth. So being picky, I think, helps in getting the most out of great men. So yeah, I'm on that spectrum. What would you think of on that sense? We're now comparing philosophies.
I think I'm possibly slightly closer to the Carlyle spectrum. I like the idea of going into a library, learning about the great men. I think definitely, Thomas Arnold of rugby. I just did a video on him to start a new series on morality and depravity in England, which I'm reading Simon Heffer, so it's a lot on my mind. He wanted people to be near perfection a lot, be perfect. He created the prefect system in English public schools so that, the lesser students could look up to that. And he was very concerned about having a core group of people that were perfect that the others then could be in the company of, and they would raise everybody's standards up. So I do think that's all true. But at the same time, I can't help but be sort of almost seduced by the Carlylean theory of greatness. There's something so different about it to other thinkers that you see today, especially. And I think Carlyle haunts, he still haunts Emerson. He still haunts Matthew Arnold that comes later, or later English thinkers. So like any thought that's so bold, so brave as Carlyle, that then kind of casts a shadow over a whole century, I just think is worthy of definitely giving time and consideration to it. Even if, yes, some of it, you're right, the bypassing of the faults is something I think we can flesh out later interpretations, and also something you can flesh out a lot in contemporary pieces as well, because a lot of people now are going into certain saviors and so on, and sometimes there are blind spots to faults, and that you could say they're following the Carlylean mold in that, in having those blind spots. So next is Emerson's going to discuss his first example of a representative.
Plato. And after that, I believe we're going to be going right into a comparison chapter where we're going to discuss Shakespeare as it is seen in Emerson and Shakespeare as it is seen in Carlyle's Heroes, and see how they intertwine and like how they break apart from each other, especially when considering a very specific great man. So yeah, that will be very interesting. We'll see you when we talk about Plato, and keep believing in great men. I don't know.
See you next time, guys.